Hey, hello, and welcome back to Science as Process and Perspective. So, this was my personal story, my personal way into philosophy. Why did I, as a scientist, start to ask these philosophical questions? From that, I would like to move on to some really, really basic questions. What is philosophy? What is science? And how do they interact? How should they interact? So, what we're going to do throughout this course is I'm going to ask you a number of questions. And I want you to pause the video and think about them whenever they get asked. Write down your own answers. That's a good exercise and will be very interesting to see what do you think about your answers when you're done with the course. So I encourage you to pause the video after each question, write down your answer, and then go back after the course and revisit them. So here's the first question, and that's a very basic question. What is philosophy? It is by no means a trivial question, and in one way, it's very important to the spirit of this course. And to explain this point, I'm going to give you maybe the original definition of philosophy, here in the version by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who says philosophy, rightly defined, is simply the love of wisdom. That is beautiful, and that's actually what the word means. Philia in Greek means love. Sophia means wisdom. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. But that barely covers it and seems a little old fashioned. Well, does it? Sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, in his 1998 book Consilience, wrote that today we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. So, wisdom is still a central sort of aspect of philosophy today. And I think this sort of ancient idea of wisdom, the wisdom of the ancients, as Leo Strauss called it, is still important today. Philosophy as a personal quest to be wise. That's very much in the spirit of this course. Ironically, this book by Wilson, Consilience, tried to subsume philosophy under the umbrella of science. That's something called scientism. We'll get back to that in a minute. And it's not what I endorse in this lecture. But there is more to philosophy than just the love of wisdom. The Oxford English Dictionary has two definitions. And the first one is as follows. It says, philosophy is the love, study, or pursuit of wisdom, truth, or knowledge, now rare. Let's dissect this a little bit. So not only do we have the love of wisdom, but also the study and pursuit of wisdom. So it's not just an emotion, philosophy, it's an activity. It's something we have to work towards. And it's not just about wisdom, it's also about truth or knowledge. The three go together. It's hard to have wisdom without truth or knowledge, but often we have truth or knowledge without wisdom. So they're not all the same. And we'll come back to those distinctions over and over again. But what does the Oxford English Dictionary mean by saying now rare? Is it that we no longer seek wisdom? What it means is that this use of the term is slightly outdated. So we said the love and pursuit of wisdom reflects the wisdom of the ancients, the idea of philosophy among the ancient Greeks, for example. While nowadays philosophy has become an academic discipline, and the second part of the OED definition reflects that. But instead, I'm going to give you the definition of Wikipedia. It reflects sort of the modern sense of philosophy as an academic discipline. It is the study of general and fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, values, reason, mind, and language. That's much broader than the original definition, so that's a good thing. So we have a more rigorous, professional, broad, and deep engagement with all sorts of questions here, not just the love of wisdom. Philosophical methods include questioning, rational argument, and systematic presentation. So there is something like a philosophical method, just like there is a scientific method. And just like the scientific method, it's hard to pin down. It's difficult to define. It's diverse. Different philosophers have different approaches. We'll come to that. But maybe that's a good thing, given the broad range of questions that modern philosophy addresses. Some of these fundamental questions are, what is real? That's something that should worry us all as scientists, as researchers. Is it possible to know anything? Is it possible to know anything for certain? That is the central sort of topic of this course. Do humans have free will? Do we have agency in the first place? These are very important questions. We won't discuss those so much here. What is a good way to live? Also a little outside the scope of this course, but very, very important and interesting. What is justice? Is beauty subjective or objective? And what is science? That again is a question that will keep us very busy here. But you can see the staggering sort of breadth of different questions. And so let us subdivide, let us classify different branches of philosophy and build up a little bit of a vocabulary of what we mean by asking different philosophical questions. So here I've subdivided philosophy into three main disciplines and then sort of an underlying foundation that lies below all of those. The first one of those is metaphysics, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowledge, identity, time, and space. And very important in this context is the specific branch of metaphysics called ontology that deals with the nature of being. What is real? What is reality? These are questions we'll encounter here. The second sort of big branch of philosophy is called epistemology. It is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. The third big branch of philosophy is value theory, which encompasses all branches of philosophy that deal with evaluative aspects. For example, ethics, the branch of philosophy that deals with moral principles, which includes political philosophy, which examines how those principles are implemented at the societal levels, not just personal principles. And also, of course, aesthetics, the branch of philosophy that deals with questions of beauty and artistic taste. Is it purely subjective? Is it general? What is it? And underneath this all is logic, a formal system or codification of the principles of proof and inference, making sure that we think properly, rationally, that we argue properly. This is philosophy. And in this course, we'll be busy with the philosophy of science in particular. That is busy with the basic question, what is science? But there's lots of other questions that it deals with. And I would like to map it onto this diagram of the different branches of philosophy. But before we do this, let's ask a few more questions that will guide us in this first discussion. So what about the philosophy of science? The first question, of course, is what is the philosophy of science? It is probably the case that very few of you who are watching this video have had any formal education in philosophy, if you're a researcher or a scientist. It is exceedingly rare nowadays to learn philosophy at a university level. Maybe you had a few classes in high school. But most science curricula do not include philosophy of science anymore. This is a real problem, as we will see. And that leads to the sort of problem that I have to ask you, do you know any philosophers of science? Write down the names of those that you know. What are those people? When did they work? Look them up on the internet. Do you know any at all? How many of you don't know any philosophers of science? Is the philosophy of science relevant for your work as a researcher, a scientist? It's likely that you answered this question with yes, because you're here, you're watching this video. But from my personal experience, I would think most of my scientific colleagues would say no. We'll revisit that in a moment. Should philosophy of science contribute to scientific research? This is very controversial. Not even philosophers of science agree on this question. I have an opinion, and I'm sure you'll soon know what it is. What are the most important questions in the philosophy of science? What kind of questions does it ask? Do you know? Can you list a few? Do you know any specific approaches to the philosophy of science? Different methods? Different philosophical schools? Can you write down such schools, the name of such schools, such approaches? And are there any areas of science for which philosophy is particularly important? Well, the answer to this question is yes. And I will provide some examples, hopefully, from those areas of science for which philosophy is particularly important. In this course, and especially in this lecture, we will focus on these three questions mainly. What is the philosophy of science? Should philosophy of science contribute to scientific research? How does it relate to science? And are there any areas of science for which philosophy is particularly important? So if we map the philosophy of science back onto this diagram of philosophy, then it's right in the middle. It includes a little bit of everything. The philosophy of science is the branch of philosophy that is concerned with the foundations, methods, and implications of science. The foundations have to do with metaphysics. What is scientific knowledge grounded on? The methods, of course, have to do with epistemology. How do we generate scientific knowledge? What is a valid way of generating knowledge in this way? And the implications of science have to do with ethics, sometimes also with aesthetics. So the philosophy of science is right in the middle and connects a lot of these different aspects of philosophy. So let's ask ourselves, what do we mean by knowledge? Have you thought about this question before? What is knowledge? What distinguishes it from mere belief? And as a starter, I'm giving you Plato's definition in his dialogue, the Theaetetus, of knowledge as justified true belief. You may have heard this sort of simple definition. It's a great definition. It's easy to memorize it. It seems plausible, and it's completely useless. So this sort of classic definition of what knowledge is has a lot of problems. But let's first try to understand what Plato means here. Knowledge is belief. You have to believe something to be true. It's true belief. Otherwise, it's not knowledge if you don't believe it's true. And you have to be able to justify why you believe it's true. That seems reasonable. So what are the problems? One of the problems is that it implicitly assumes that knowledge is only based on propositions, propositional knowledge. Propositions are statements that are either true or false. So knowledge in this view consists of true propositions. So this limits knowledge to the realm of language. You cannot think about what you cannot express in language, which is weird. There is tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge. There is know how and know to. You know how to ride a bike, okay? But you cannot explain it to someone and then they can go and ride a bike. This is embodied knowledge. You have to be able to ride the bike to practice yourself. Otherwise, you won't learn it. So obviously, there is more to a lot of skills than just language. Think about trying to replicate a protocol in the laboratory. And often you got this from a colleague in a different laboratory and you can't get it to work. And so it takes lots of tries and discussions with that person until you figure out how to get the skills to do this. Very common. The second limitation here is that this kind of knowledge is either true or false, black or white. There's nothing in between. There are no degrees of certainty or anything like that. And that, as we will see, is a problem. And the third problem that kind of kills it completely is that this definition is not, it may be necessary for knowledge, but it's not sufficient for knowledge, okay? And this was pointed out in a very short paper in 1963 by Edmund Gettier, which was entitled, "Is Knowledge Justify True Belief?" And its conclusion is no, because he states two brief counterexamples in this paper that show that you can have justified true belief that is not knowledge. You can still be wrong even though you believe something to be true and you can justify it. So we're not going to use this sort of definition of knowledge. Instead, this course is about building up, rebuilding a sort of more pragmatic, empirical way of building, constructing knowledge that we can trust. So we're not aiming for absolute knowledge here, or for some sort of watertight definition of what knowledge is. But we're trying to understand knowledge in its many manifestations, in its many contexts. That's very important. So the last thing I need to clear up here is, what do I mean by science? That's just a matter of definition. Basically, I'm going to use a very broad sort of sense of science. You can trace this word back to Latin, scientia. And in Latin, the word means knowledge, plain and simple. No sort of restrictions on it, any kind of knowledge. And some languages have retained a very broad sense of what, science means. For example, the word Wissenschaft in German, which literally translates as sort of how to organize, how to structure knowledge, includes any study that involves systematic research. So not just the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, geology, plus the social sciences, psychology, sociology, economics, formal sciences, mathematics, logic. They're a bit special, we'll come back to that. But it also includes humanities subjects such as history, and even literary studies are called Literaturwissenschaft in German, very broad. While in English, the sense of the word science is much narrower in its meaning. And it encompasses only systematic empirical research. Nobody would call literary studies in English as science. Even history is not a science. Philosophy itself, by the way, is not a science. And I'll show you why that is. So we're going to use a very sort of broad, more Germanic sort of sense of the term. Any study that involves systematic research. And I welcome all researchers from all kinds of areas in this course. And I think it's relevant for all kinds of areas of systematic research. So both the natural and the social sciences. Okay, so far so good. So let's ask a question: how should philosophy and science interact? And this is a very controversial question. This, by the way, is one of my favorite comics websites, Existential Comics. And I'm showing you a brief excerpt from one of the great cartoons on there. You have, I wouldn't call them scientists maybe, but sort of people who represent science in the public. Richard Dawkins with a green tie saying philosophy, ha, nothing could be more useless. Sam Harris in his blue shirt says exactly, all the so-called philosophical problems will be solved with science. This is an attitude called scientism, and it's a problem. Neil deGrasse Tyson here in the middle, yes, it's all empty speculation, whereas we scientists use evidence, we make progress. We'll revisit that in the next lecture. And here you have Simone de Beauvoir bursting through the door, saying no scientific fact can give a purpose to our lives. Richard Dawkins is hit by Simone Weil, saying, but philosophy is useless, all we need is. And she says that is a philosophical statement. I don't know if you've heard people like Stephen Hawking saying philosophy is dead, not noticing that that's a philosophical statement. It's completely ridiculous. Okay, so the problem is that there is a sort of a lack of respect often on the side of scientists and people who represent science to the public about philosophy, and a misunderstanding, such that often these people are tackling questions that are beyond the scientific with science. A good example is Richard Dawkins' God delusion, where he's trying to prove through an argument from improbability that God does not exist. It's completely absurd because arguably the concept of God is not well defined enough to be testable. That's one problem. The other thing is, of course, that this argument from improbability can also be applied to Dawkins' theory of the origin of life itself. He basically says, oh, there was a sort of a hurricane that went through a scrapyard and built an airplane. Literally, that's in the Blind Watchmaker. And so that's a miracle. That's not a scientific explanation. And you can use that argument from improbability saying that Richard Dawkins just proved that life does not exist. So it's astonishing how perfectly smart people like Neil deGrasse Tyson can go online saying, do not study philosophy. It's going to be replaced by science in the future. So these people don't understand the first thing about philosophy, and that is philosophy is not and will never be science. G.M. Anscombe in the right lower panel here tells Neil deGrasse Tyson, you are stupid in a way. That's because philosophy of science is a different thing than science, which asks different questions. That doesn't mean that philosophy shouldn't be informed by science, but it is not reducible to science. It is not part of science. Rather, it's the other way around. So scientism is an ideology which claims that science can solve all problems or that all problems are empirical. And as an ideology, it's a philosophical stance. It's a philosophical doctrine. And I will show you over the course of these lectures that it is no longer tenable. This type of philosophical doctrine is no longer a reasonable doctrine to defend. We need a more sophisticated view of science and philosophy and how they interact. So here I'm quoting Dan Dennett, and he's saying there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. Just like the Wilson quote. This is from a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, whose own philosophical baggage is undeniable and very heavy. So it's a bit ironic, but it's a good quote in this context, okay? You have a philosophy, even if you've never studied philosophy, even if you don't know you have it, and even if you go publicly saying, you know, that philosophy is dead, that is a philosophy, and it's completely self-defeating and stupid to say that. So philosophy will not be replaced by science because that's not the point. Here is a nice modification of an XKCD comic that was the frame. Up on top shows you fields arranged by purity. Of course, that's a joke. So sociologist is the least pure, sociology is the least pure science here. And then you go on and on to the right by physics, of course, biology, physics, to mathematicians that can't even see the others. And someone drew this additional little stick man at the bottom, epistemological philosophers. Without them, none of this would even be possible. This whole line they're standing on wouldn't even exist, okay? So philosophy provides a context for science, but the two can interact very closely. And actually, for most of human history, they have not been separate. While philosophy is not science, science is a branch of philosophy, arguably. And it all starts with the pre-Socratic. Maybe Thales of Miletus, the first pre-Socratic philosopher, who said everything is based on water, which is a silly thing to say maybe. But the interesting thing about Thales is he was the first to not explain nature through narratives, gods fighting it out, but a principle called an arche. And that principle, that universal principle for him was water. Not very serious. So his predecessor, Anaximander, he was much more sophisticated. He said, water, ain't it? Nature is governed by laws, okay? And so you have sort of the indefinite, the boundless, something he called the apeiron, an abstract principle, not an element like water, is the source of all things. And all things come from the apeiron and they go back into the apeiron. And this is really interesting. The reason for this constant dynamic coming and going is that by existing, you incur a certain debt to the universe that you need to pay back by decaying or dying. It's a beautiful sort of very dynamic processual view of the world. He was a genius in many senses. He also um, said that humans descended from fish eventually, although he didn't have a real theory of evolution. He said the sun is much larger than the earth. It's a huge fireball, and the earth is either cylinder shaped or round, and so on and so forth. He was way ahead of his time. And so he's often, for these reasons, called the first scientist, although, of course, this word did not exist back then. And you can continue this story to Parmenides, who was the first metaphysician, people say. He was the first to come up with an entire sort of theory of the world. To Aristotle, who was as much a philosopher as he was a scientist. Apart from writing the metaphysics, he wrote his physics, obviously, but also mostly his scientific work was in biology. It was, he gets a lot of bad reputation for just sitting around thinking, but he actually informed his studies by field work. He got a few things wrong, like the sperm is the principle of all life and the egg is just sort of an incubator, or we think with our heart instead of our brains. But he also did he published 4 books on the taxonomy of different animals and so on and so forth. So his scientific work was as important and was seamlessly part of his philosophical work. Going ahead quite a bit, Copernicus. These are all people who would not consider themselves philosophers or scientists, but natural philosophers. The geocentric versus heliocentric worldview here, starting the scientific revolution. Galileo and his sort of discussions with the church. Descartes, often seen purely as a philosopher, but he's the first to come up with a mechanistic view of the world, and also animals, living beings as mechanisms. Newton, of course. Clockwork universe. Leibniz, a wonderful philosopher and also mathematician and scientist, jointly inventing the calculus with Newton. Lavoisier, the father of chemistry. Goethe, surprisingly enough, considered himself not a poet, but a scientist. He worked on all kinds of things. He had his own theory of colors that contradicted Newton's theory, and he studied the transformation of the metamorphosis of different, the morphogenesis of different plants and animals. So Goethe himself considered himself foremost a scientist, and poetry and writing was his hobby. And this goes right up to 1867, when Lord Kelvin co-authors a treatise on natural philosophy. So this strict separation of science and philosophy is a very recent thing. It starts with Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes. It starts with the scientific revolution. And that's the time when this notion of science being a separate sort of activity becomes a thing. So let's look at sort of the foundations of knowledge. And there's a really big schism from the scientific revolution onwards about how to ground science. So philosophy here is at the service of science. It's grounding scientific knowledge in 2 radically different ways. John Locke comes up with this expression of philosophy being the handmaiden of the sciences. Suddenly, philosophy becomes a tool for the services, providing a service to science. And Locke, just as Francis Bacon and David Hume, he was an empiricist. So these people thought that knowledge ultimately is based on experience. While the rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, thought that reason is the chief source of knowledge. This was later combined by Kant and the positivists into a sort of a rationalist empiricist doctrine. We'll come back to that in a minute. So here, philosophy is sort of suddenly subservient to science. It serves the role of justifying why science is important and why it provides proper knowledge. So that's a big turn. That's one of the big turns in the history of philosophy and science. But this idea of science and doing science and being a scientist, it's very recent. So this is the first scientist, a woman, after the whole sausage fest I was showing you. Apologies for that, but this is all of these, most of these big figures in natural philosophy are men. But here's Mary Somerville, arguably the first scientist, because the term scientist was first used by William Whewell in a review of her on the connection of the physical sciences, a book that she wrote, and he was at a loss of a name because people doing science at the time were called men of science. This is the 19th century, 1833. And so he needed to come up with a new term that included a woman, which was scientist. So here is the first ever official scientist. And everything before 1833, if you use the term scientist, it's an anachronism. Anything before the scientific revolution and use the word science, it just means knowledge. Philosophy and science are one thing. And so this diversification is very recent. And this all culminates, this whole rationalist empiricist sort of debate, also in the doctrine of positivism. And science now becomes sort of the judicial branch, philosophy becomes the judicial branch of science. Okay, no longer the handmaiden, but sort of the judge of what proper knowledge is. And this is Auguste Kant, who was the founder of sociology and also an excellent philosopher and the founder of positivism. And he subdivided the entire history of human knowledge into three main stages. The first is theological, which he called fictitious. We come up with narratives and later on abstractions, like the monotheistic gods in different religions, abstract principles, but still completely made up, that explain the features of the real world. Then as a second stage, we become metaphysical, abstract. So this is what the pre-Socratic philosophers already did by saying it's water, the general principle, the arche of the world, or the apeiron. But it's still abstract and it's not grounded in any sort of experiential knowledge. And so we enter with empiricism the third stage, positive stage of human knowledge, scientific stage. And science in positivism is sort of a combination of rationalism and empiricism. It is information derived from sensory experience, interpreted through reason and knowledge, that forms the source of all certain knowledge. Okay? This is very important because this is a view that many scientists still hold today. We'll look at that extensively in the next lecture and then criticize it. But before I do that, just a quick outlook on one last aspect of science, and that is, it is a practical activity that is carried out in a context, a historical, a social, a political context. And that's the subject of a very recent discipline that sits between philosophy and sociology and anthropology. It's called Science, Technology, and Society, or STS studies. And it's basically philosophy as anthropology, not as a judicial branch of judging what is proper knowledge and what is not. But it looks at scientists as if they were some kind of tribe and looks at their societal function. For example, we'll encounter in next lecture Robert Merton's Sociology of Science. He looks at the sort of organization, the institutional organizations and their function in science, in society. Thomas Kuhn, who talks about scientific revolutions, paradigms, we'll talk about him as well. And then this is one for the last lecture, Bruno Latour and his ideas of actor network, sort of theory that looks at science as sort of a practice embedded in a community. The norms of science are drawn from the practices of the community, and communities are networks of human and non-human actors. We'll come back to that, what that means exactly. So that was a very quick sort of tour and superficial tour through the history of the interaction between philosophy and science. So what about this interaction today? Is it, as Richard Feynman, physicist, says in this famous quote, the philosophy of science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. By the way, he may have actually never said this. I couldn't trace any precise source. So If you find a source, please email it to me. Okay, is that true? Is the philosophy of science as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds? Well, we could say, okay, so this is sort of getting things wrong in two ways. One is, why would we expect the philosophy of science to serve science? Okay, so that's sort of the handmaiden or judicial branch view of science. Why does it have to have a function within science? Can't the philosophers of science have their own thing to do? And maybe it's not important, but maybe that's not a problem. Or, and I sympathize a lot with this view, here is biologist Carl Bergstrom, who tweets, Feynman writes, the philosophy of science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds, but ornithology would be quite useful to birds if they could understand it. That's the spirit of this course. So we are trying as scientists to understand the philosophy of science. And I want to show you during this course that it's a useful thing to do. So the spirit of this course will be, there's really only one single domain of inquiry, and an obsession with demarcating science and philosophy is just not very useful, okay? Because there is contiguity between the two. Scientific questions or philosophical questions. There is no demarcation. There are different aspects of the same questions. And there's reciprocity. Science and philosophy inform each other for each other's benefit. So in my opinion, and I let this stand as a point for discussion, philosophy and science are both best done together. A philosophical science, a philosophy of science. Okay? So more a philosophical science than a philosophy of science. The two go together. So what we'll do next is I will introduce a sort of what I would call the standard view of science, and then I will criticize this view and look at a more sort of practical, embedded view of what it means to create scientific knowledge, what it means to do philosophical science. And I hope you will tune in again next time when we talk about the standard view of science. Thank you very much. See you again soon.